at the law school. I'm really happy to welcome Professor Kristine Bowman. She's a professor of law, as any of you who've read the biography will know, at Michigan State University. It was also really interesting to read her profile, that she's worked actually in the schools, with the schools in terms of civil rights in the US, and obviously incredibly important work. So we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. We also have two discussants with us today, Professor Nicaroni from the law school and Professor Kath Gelber, who's the head of school of political sciences and international studies. So they'll be asking a couple of questions to kick us off. We're planning to finish up the formal part of this on the hour, but we'll all stay around if you like to ask questions. The speaker will stay back and the discussions will stay back, so there'll be opportunity to extend to 2:30 if you're really interested, but if you have to go off and teach on the hour or do whatever you have to do, that's absolutely fine. So I'll hand over to our speaker, and we really look forward to hearing from you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that warm introduction and welcome, and also I appreciate the welcome I've received from colleagues in Pulsus and Law over the whole semester. It really has been a wonderful time to be on sabbatical here. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, I'll begin the presentation, of course. There we go. With a bit of an overview. Here's what I hope that we will do over the next half hour. First, I'll tell you a bit about my prior research and give you some context for who I am and what I bring to this discussion. Then we'll focus a little more on the problem and the question that I've been spending so much time thinking about this semester. What we'll talk about here today is also the comparative framework that we will be using to go through the remainder of the talk, thinking about free speech on campus in U.S. elementary and secondary schools, U.S. colleges and universities, and Australian colleges and universities. And then, of course, conclude with some of my insights as a result of this and questions from our discussants, questions, comments from all of you. So, my prior research. I focus my work for about the past 20 years on education law. In the U.S., this is a niche field, but it is a very well-developed niche field. In every state, there are going to be a few different law firms that focus on representing school districts, and this is what my work was when I was in practice, and my scholarship has grown out of that work. I should also note that in the U.S., we call that system the K-12 system. What you call prep, we call kindergarten, so kindergarten through year 12. I'll try not to use that term today, but if I do, that's just to note that that's what I'm thinking about. Now, in the U.S., as we think about the purpose of public schools, particularly primary and secondary, we're focusing a lot on the public good of schools. Why do we have these schools? Why is the government paying for them? What do we all get out of it? So we're focused on the public good, in particular, of creating citizens. And that is the goal that animates so much of the Supreme Court's decisions in this area. And there have been quite a few decisions in this area. My work, my scholarship more particularly, engages both ideas of liberty and equality. So I'm thinking about individual liberties, I'm thinking about free speech, I'm thinking about religious expression, and I'm also thinking about equality, thinking about groups, thinking about advantages and disadvantages, thinking about how systems work together to create and perpetuate various equalities and inequalities. Now, some of my work has focused on school desegregation. So Brown versus Board is a concept and a case that is famous world over, the idea that students cannot be segregated on the basis of their race. That, of course, has given rise to a tremendous amount of litigation, a tremendous amount of scholarship, and a tremendous amount of policy. Some of my work is very much in that area. And, of course, as we have moved forward in that way, we've also come to realize and confront many of the more nuanced challenges when we are seeking to have schools that are much more equitable. So there's a lot going on there. Free speech can be related to that, is more related to that in the higher education context, I'll contend. But it's definitely connected. And in fact, some of our earliest free speech in schools cases in the U.S. came out of the civil rights context. So we had elementary and secondary school students who were seeking to protest in their schools, and that was some of the work that gave rise to what would become Brown versus Board of Education. Those were some of the cases that started to test out and think through the legal tests that would become present in Brown. So, the types of questions that I ask in my work, things like, how did the rules come to be? What do the rules really permit? How gaps in the doctrine should be filled. So this is a lot of doctrinal analysis. It's a lot of normative analysis. But my work is also very much in the spirit of socio-legal work, because I'm not asking these questions looking only at cases, right? I'm situating them in the social context. I'm situating them in the political context. So that is, in a nutshell, where I've been, what I've been doing for many years now. So today our work is thinking a lot about liberty and equality in higher education. Purpose of the universities. Yes, there is a public good element to universities, and particularly if they're publicly funded, that connection seems to be quite clear. There's also a private good element to universities. And in the U.S., it's actually more of the private good aspect that is how we think about things. Now, what's going on campuses a lot in the U.S. these days is this discussion. So on the top, free speech does not equal comfortable speech. We have a lot of people who are saying that very strongly. And on the bottom, it's not about free speech, it's about bigots trying to normalize hate. We have a lot of people saying that. We have a lot of people saying that very strongly. And so we have these controversies, we have these discussions, and we have a lot of polarization. And from my point of view, we also are stuck because of this polarization. So, how can we move forward? How can we get unstuck? Sorry about this. That's all right. No, I'm very flattered that we need to bring in more chairs. And thank you all for coming and finding the room and making time to be here, and all of you as well. Okay, so thinking through this, I decided to take a comparative approach. And going back a while, part of this was thinking about, well, what project do I want to be thinking about during sabbatical, right? I have this wonderful length of time when I can just sink into new ideas, into new research, and really engage a problem and take my research in another direction and build on what's come before. So, knowing that my partner and I would be here, I was thinking about, well, okay, what's going on in Australia and the US? And I started to read more about Australia and come across a number of free speech controversies here as well. And I was thinking, well, this could be very good. It builds on my work in elementary and secondary schools, also gives me a comparative framework. And then, of course, I was also reading work by some of you all here, particularly Professor Gelber, and thinking, I think this could be a really good project to dive into. And I like thinking about things in a comparative way because, well, when you all travel, how many of you have gone to a grocery store in another country? Anyone? Right. Well, so a lot of you have. And when I travel, it's just such a wonderful way to capture the types of insights that we can get from travel and I think from comparative work, right? Because we walk into a grocery store, we know what we're used to seeing in our own grocery store, and then all of a sudden we say, oh, okay, there's not an aisle full of breakfast cereal, there are two choices. And up until that point, I hadn't really thought thought about the fact that I have an aisle full of breakfast cereal options, but now I'm thinking about it. And so that's the comparative perspective that we're trying to bring here. Not exactly breakfast cereal, of course, but the idea that seeing things through a new lens helps to unsettle assumptions, helps to unsettle expectations. And my goal here, again, with this project is to try and think about how this conversation in the U.S. can move forward. So we clearly need to do something differently than what we've been doing. We need to have a conversation different than what we have been having. And I'm not suggesting that we should just import one policy, import one set of laws into something else, but that thinking deeply about other systems can help us reflect on what's going on in our own and see it from a new angle. So the systems, again, the 3 school systems that I have mentioned. The questions, first, social political context, second, legal, and third, thinking about current controversies. All right, and again, because this is my area of deepest expertise, I will try to not spend too much time talking about primary and secondary schools in the U.S. But here's as much information as I can try and deliver as quickly as possible. Okay, so our social and political context, again, at a very general level. In the U.S., and I appreciate the work of Professor Roney, Professor Gilbert in this regard. They've both done very interesting comparative work about the U.S. and Australia, among other things. The U.S. is generally much more libertarian than Australia, more focused on individual rights, okay? So painting with a really broad brush here about, and thinking about some fundamental social differences. U.S. is a rights culture. The Bill of Rights is written down. The Constitution is often thought of more closely to a sacred text than to a government document. The Bill of Rights protects free speech explicitly, and of course, a handful of other important freedoms. And that ties into the legal framework for these issues. First, there is a lot of doctrine in this area. And I think it's not just a difference in scope compared to Australia, it's a difference in kind. So, there's a lot of doctrine. The cases I've listed up here are the 4 best-known Supreme Court decisions in this area regulating student speech. But the basic idea is that in the U.S., students have free speech rules and free speech rights in schools, and those rights are very different than the free speech rights that citizens have in any other context for any other reason. So, why are they different? Well, and why do they exist is another important question too, right? Why do they exist? The Supreme Court has said, getting back to that public good idea, schools train children to become citizens. They train children to become part of our democracy. And so, students need to be able to exercise their free speech to start to become able to do that later in life when they're citizens. That's the basic idea. Now, why are these rights so much more limited than in the general context, general society? Well, first, look at that picture. In schools, we might be talking about 18-year-olds. We're also talking about 5-year-olds. And so there are a lot of limitations that we need to have simply because some things are just not age appropriate. Also, what's going on in schools? Yes, nearly all American students are in public schools run by the government. But at the same time, we also are asking these schools to do certain things, to teach curriculum. They can't just have a freewheeling discussion about anything that anyone might want to talk about because they have to accomplish certain things. So, also, it's a captive audience. We require students to attend school. Whether they attend public or private is a choice, but we require them to be there. So, those are reasons why the rules are different in these schools. And essentially, if speech is too disruptive, if speech is lewd, if the school has a legitimate pedagogical reason for restricting the speech, the school can restrict the speech. So, yes, students have rights, but they can be limited quite significantly. So now, in the US, here's where the controversies are. Here's where the difficult discussions are happening. Okay, online speech, students and teachers. This is just a wide open area right now in the US. Because if students are on any of these wonderful social media platforms, one student says something horrific to another student, and then that bleeds over into the school environment. Parent comes into the principal saying, why are you not disciplining that other child for doing this thing to my child? And the principal says, well, because neither of them were at school, how do we have jurisdiction? Well, sometimes courts have held that schools have jurisdiction because the events impact the school environment and the learning so much that the school essentially acquires jurisdiction because of the disruption. We could get into that. It's really messy. It's really complicated. And I will be very curious to see how this sorts itself out. Teachers. That's another area for online speech that is becoming quite difficult. But teachers' rights are much more limited than students' free speech rights. And especially after a U.S. Supreme Court decision about a little more than 10 years ago, teachers' free speech rights in schools are basically slim to none in terms of the content. Outside of schools, they have broader speech rights. Online speech ties into bullying, a whole set of issues there. And then this idea of content and viewpoint restrictions. Can the school restrict based on content? Can it restrict based on viewpoint? In the U.S., if we're having a conversation among constitutional scholars and lawyers, someone would say content discrimination. I wouldn't be surprised if there was sort of a collective gasp in the room, like, oh, you wouldn't dare. Viewpoint discrimination, the same thing, you wouldn't dare. But guess what? I think we have a lot of content and viewpoint discrimination in public schools that we are all okay with. And some of my scholarship has interrogated that idea, that in these schools, we have content and viewpoint discrimination all the time. Because guess what? We have curricula that schools and states adopt and teachers teach, and it's not, let's put all of these ideas on the table. It's, here's what happened. Here's how we think about these things. And yes, they teach critical thinking, but they also teach that there are objective truths. So, now moving on to public universities. Again, take a look at this slide. And you'll notice that I've tried to balance the political perspectives that come up in the photos that I put throughout. This one, hate is not a political view. No one is free when others are oppressed. Okay, so what's going on in U.S. public universities? Well, social and political context, of course, pretty much the same as our elementary and secondary schools. Our legal context, we are thinking about our generally applicable free speech rules. Not the special rules that apply in elementary and secondary schools, but we are thinking about the broadest free speech protections, arguably, that exist in the world. So, there are very few reasons for curtailing free speech. I've listed a few. Time, place, and manner. Government, with good enough reasons, can limit the time, place, and manner of expression, as long as we have other ways and other forums to express those ideas. If speech is a true threat, if it incites violence, if it constitutes discrimination or harassment, these are other reasons why speech is not protected as free speech. So even in the US, with the most robust free speech protections in the world, free speech is not absolute. And I mentioned earlier, no content or viewpoint discrimination, this is going to be something to really think about, because that's a general constitutional value in the United States. That's a widely shared constitutional value. So, we have all of the free speech doctrine. We have a tremendous amount of case law on a lot of these things. And we also have a couple areas, other areas we need to be thinking about. Academic freedom, which in the U.S. is primarily in, well, AAUP, American Association of University Professors, in their 1940 document, and in university policies and procedures throughout. So that's how we see these principles coming up, protecting freedom of teaching, protecting freedom in scholarship. And then we also have the government speech doctrine. I'm just going to put a pin in this one. We won't get into it in depth. But I'll note that the government speech doctrine is this area of constitutional jurisprudence where the court is recognizing that the government can have an opinion. So remember what I was talking about regarding school curriculum? That's a great example of government speech, right? The government can have an opinion. So how does that work in concert with viewpoint neutrality? Interesting questions. All right. Now again, this is how some people view the current free speech debates in the U.S., right? Liberal thought police, see no opposing views, hear no opposing views, speak of no opposing views. This is how some people would describe what is going on in the U.S. Now, there's a lot that's going on in the U.S., right? We have students who are talking about their speech rights. We have students who are who are protesting. We have students, we have students who are calling for safe spaces. We have a lot of student speech that's coming into this mix. Some of these protests turn violent. Some of them seek to disrupt events that are scheduled and therefore to disrupt speech and prevent it from happening. Faculty and staff also are part of what's been going on. Thinking about their own protests, thinking about whether the university can say to, can say to faculty, you must put trigger warnings in your syllabus. Faculty also have been subject to discipline and asked to apologize for various political statements made inside and outside of the classroom. Outside speakers, this has gotten a lot of attention. Thinking about deplatforming. Over the past 3 years or so, by one count, there have been about 100 attempts to deplatform speakers at U.S. colleges and universities, and about half of those have been successful. So we've had about 50 speakers, by one estimation, that were invited or that were granted permission to be present at a university, and then were told, nope, can't come after all. And sometimes I think they might have found the situation so difficult that some of the speakers themselves withdrew. So we have that going on. And then, a bit of a tie-in to government speech doctrine, we have the university itself, right? To what extent can the university speak? If Richard Spencer, white supremacist, is on campus, to what extent can the university issue a statement? What extent can the university engage with those ideas in multiple ways and challenge those ideas? People have different ideas about what universities can do. People also have different ideas about what universities should do. Now, of course, all of this is going on, and we have the Chicago Principles issued by a faculty committee or drafted by a faculty committee at University of Chicago in 2015, capturing a very solid and traditional view of free speech on campus. That the purpose of a university is to create knowledge. That the purpose of the university is to be a place where ideas can be discussed and debated, no matter how offensive they might be. And the Chicago principles, because of this and because of the way they've captured these ideas, have become very popular. They're certainly part of the discussion, and there are, at this point, I believe, about 60 universities that have adopted or endorsed the statement that we know as the Chicago Principles. And most recently, President Trump issued an executive order. This took place in March, I believe. And this one is a bit difficult. It made some headlines, so I feel the need to address it. But I also think it's important to recognize that the executive order really doesn't change anything, because it says to the public universities you must comply with the First Amendment, which they were already required to do. And it says to the private universities you must follow your own rules, which presumably they were going to do anyway. So I think that comes into the debate. It's important to recognize more for the political dimensions of what might be going on there than the idea that it changes anything, because I don't think it really does change anything. Okay. So now, moving into thinking about Australian universities. Okay, again, our big picture purpose for universities in Australia, very much the same as in the US, right? Creating knowledge, pursuing truth, the idea that the university itself is a public good, that the students, the graduates, the research, everything that the university allows, facilitates, and produces, that this is a public good. Now, social and political context, and again, I'm indebted to Professors Gelber and Aroni for their work on this. Social political context, as compared to the US, is more receptive to regulation, perhaps more of a utilitarian approach, less of a focus on individual rights. Relatedly, thinking about the extension into the legal framework, no written Bill of Rights. So, the role of courts is much more limited in Australia than it is in the US. So when I was saying earlier that there are these huge bodies of doctrine in the US about free speech in elementary, secondary, and higher ed, and that's just really not the case in Australia, particularly with regard to elementary, secondary. Again, I think of that as a difference in kind, not a difference in scope, or a difference in scale. So, we have a free speech provision in Australia that is implied. So, created by the High Court in 1992. And free speech on campus is a requirement of Australian law. It's in federal law, it's in the Higher Education Support Act, and it's also in enterprise agreements and university policies. Actually, it's in 36 of 38 enterprise agreements and all university policies. Another big difference, Australia has hate speech legislation at the federal and state level, and the US does not. So that is all coming into play here. So whose speech? Again, we could be talking about all of these different speakers. And I think to the extent that there's been discussion about whether there's a crisis in free speech in Australian universities, I think that's focused more on the idea of deplatforming, so outside speakers. But as I've been talking with people here and at other institutions over the course of the semester, when I say I'm working on free speech on campus, that brings to mind something different for so many people I talk to, right? Someone might think about student speech or student organization. On the way over here today, I kid you not, a student handed me this, a leaflet, vote no to Ramsey, student general meeting. And I just loved that I was on my way to give a talk about free speech, and here was this wonderful young woman exercising her free speech. I really wanted to stop and talk with her about it, but I thought, you know, I will just tell her thank you for the pamphlet and leave her to continue her business. But we have things like this. And as I understand, this is a controversy on this campus and perhaps others that doesn't just involve students, right? So we have people in all different parts of the university community thinking about these things. Now, outside speakers, of course, also are part of the conflicts. And Bettina Ant and her comments and the controversy, the protest regarding her speech was part of what led, as I understand it, to the inquiry into free speech on campus. And this is something that was a Twitter post. The riot squad was called to the University of Sydney after protesters blocked corridors, stopping students who wanted to go to a talk by sex therapist Bettina Ant, who has spoken out against changing sexual consent laws. So, this is an example, again, of the type of controversy that we're talking about. So, Bettina Ant, Milo Yiannopoulos, we have the French inquiry that just happened and the incredibly comprehensive 300-page report that was produced as a result. And you know what the French report found? It said, there have been about a half dozen incidents involving deplatforming, and I believe they would consider this deplatforming, trying to prevent the speaker. There have been about a half dozen incidents over the past 4 years. So the French inquiry was asked, is there a crisis? And the response was no. The report also said there are some things we could do differently. First, the federal statute regarding higher education, it does protect free speech and academic freedom, but it could do so more clearly. And here's some language to consider as we're thinking about potentially amending that. And it also said, what about a voluntary model code to be adopted by universities? It would explicitly protect free expression of ideas. It would apply to both faculty and students. There is no right to be free from offense or disagreement, but speakers cannot threaten, intimidate, or discriminate through their speech. And so that's where things stand now. The report was issued relatively recently. Now, if I can get to the next slide, here we go. So, starting to wind up my part of the talk, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation and the comments and questions from the discussants. Remember, we started by thinking about the purpose for comparison, trying to shed some new light, for me most significantly, on what's going on American campuses. But for all of us, no matter where we sit, perhaps thinking differently about the aspect we're most familiar with. So, first point. Often we talk about the American system and the Australian system as though they're these two very, very different things, and we never talk about the elementary and secondary free speech rights in the U.S. And you know what? I think those are much more a hybrid of the two systems, and therefore form a really important comparison. Also because we can't design experiments, or at least I don't happen to be able to design experiments to create societies where we put different free speech rules in place. But if we look more closely, I think we have a really interesting point there that's between these two extremes. All right. The U.S. elementary secondary system also influences the higher ed system. Students are learning to be citizens. They're learning that the First Amendment means one thing, and then they get to college and they're expecting it to be the same, but it's not. And so that's something where I think in the U.S. we can do a much better job of educating our students for citizenship by talking about the different free speech rules in both places, and even more talking about the values that drive free speech in a democracy, the values that underpin free speech. Another aspect, another issue is thinking about a crisis, whether there is a so-called crisis. A lot has been written about whether there's a crisis. And I think when most people are asking this question, they're talking often about deplatforming speakers, and I haven't done an empirical survey, but my sense is that it's also talking about deplatforming speakers on the right. And so, again, this is admittedly my general sense of what's going on in these two areas. But thinking about that, I think our countries are talking about this question in the same way. I think we're asking the same question, but we're doing so in such different contexts, in such different environments, that to pretend we're answering in the same way, I think is really problematic, right? So I think it's a similar question, but the question means really different things in a country with hate speech laws and in a country without hate speech laws, in a country with robust First Amendment protections and in a country with an implied freedom to political communication, right? Just really, really different things. And then finally, there's been conversation about the Chicago Principles. Thank you. And whether the Chicago Principles should be on the table in Australia. The French report captures a lot of these Chicago Principles. And it's interesting to think about that. Because again, from my perspective, thinking about the Chicago Principles in a country with hate speech protections is really different than thinking about the Chicago Principles in a country without them. Because in the US, a big criticism of the Chicago Principles, well, it gets back to one of the ideas that I captured in a previous slide. I think it was a protester's sign, right? The idea that from some students, from some scholars' perspectives, free speech is being used to protect hatred. It's being used to protect bigotry. And now we're at a point in the US, and perhaps you are in Australia as well, where we have more diverse campuses than we have ever had in our history. And we are inviting these students to our campus. And these students are standing up and saying, as we saw some students saying here, what do you mean? You invite me here, but I'm not welcome? You invite me here, but you don't want me here? You admitted me, but not really? And these are really hard questions for us to engage. These are complicated questions, these are nuanced questions, and these are questions where I think we can begin to move forward if we're engaging from very different perspectives with good faith and with respect for what we are hearing. And so that's how I have tried to approach this research. That's the spirit in which I welcome all of your comments and questions. And that ties up my comments for the moment. I would like to invite our discussants to comment. I'm going to find a pen so I can make notes for myself about their comments and all of yours. And I think we have, about 20 minutes, and then I'll be able to stay after that. But I know some of you will need to get to other things that you need to do. All right.